Hello everyone and welcome back to another Wizard101 video. I promised that I could make a more positive video. You may or may not have believed me, but I said it at the time. I was like, I can make a more positive video, so I was going to. So today I want to talk about the most underrated worlds in Wizard101. Now, how I wanted to do this and how I ended up doing this is I asked the question in my community post. I was like, what's your opinion on it? Took everyone's answers, wrote it down, and I also have my own opinion. So I'm going to start off with your guys' opinion. It's a small sample size, so obviously not all of you will agree with this, but I thought it'd be a little bit more interesting than just me giving my opinion on underrated worlds, because I may have a differing opinion to you. I probably do. So without further ado, let's get into it. So how I took this data is I just looked at everyone's comments and then I tallied the likes on each comment and then added them all up, and these are the results. As you guys can see right here, point down, these are the results. I didn't order them, which was admittedly stupid of me, but as you can see, let me hold it up so I can see for myself. Grizzleheim came in first with 10 votes. Next we hit Imperia with 6. We have Caramel with 4, and then a smattering of other ones following that: Celestia, Wisteria, Khrysalis, then Lemuria. That one guy, Lemuria, respect to him, I salute you. Someone has to like Lemuria, and apparently it has to be you. So I'm gonna give the top 3 underrated here, give my opinions on whether I think each of these are not, and then I'll go into my opinions on them. But the most underrated world, according to the community, is Grizzleheim. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this surprised me a lot, because if I'm being honest, I'm pretty sure that Grizzleheim is rated very highly already. Like, from most rankings of worlds I see and most people's opinions on worlds, a lot of people have Grizzleheim very, very high. So I was a bit surprised that this was in the underrated list. I feel like, if anything, it might be a little bit overrated. Grizzleheim is a good world, don't get me wrong. I do love the world. I just think that it gets a lot of love, like a lot of love, and I don't know if it's that good to justify it. Grizzleheim is a very, very solid world. It has very iconic music, iconic scenery, good characters, a kind of nice quest line. The only thing I don't like about it, and the reason why I might say it's a little bit overrated, is, if I'm being honest, upon redo multiple times, Grizzleheim itself is not very fun. It's really Wintertusk that's fun, in my opinion. Merkholm Keep and Ravenscar both really suck, and they take up most of Grizzleheim. Like, if you're just doing Grizzleheim, Ravenscar ends up taking up like 25 to 50% of the total time you're in Grizzleheim. With most of my playthroughs, like, it's like an hour plus compared to the other streets, which are 20 to 30 minutes. And honestly, that kind of brings down the world for me. And if anything, I would say it's a bit overrated. Next up, we have Imperia, and this one surprised me less. I will say I do genuinely enjoy Imperia Part 2, and it's been a long time since I've done Imperia in general, but I do remember the world being at least fun to play most of the time. In terms of underrated, I would say that this is actually a pretty good pick, because I think that a lot of people hate on Imperia, especially when it came out. A lot of people hated Imperia, but I don't think that's very fair to the world. I think it's a long world, which can make it a bit kind of not horrible to go through, but it can feel like a slog at times, especially Imperia Part 1, which has a lot of streets and whatnot that are very bland to look at and kind of long and a little bit boring. But I will say, and I will give it this, Imperia has some very fun characters. It has a very interesting ending. It's not too difficult, but it's not too easy either. And I would say overall, for an end of arc world, like comparing Dragonspire, Khrysalis, Imperia, and Wallaroo, I would say it's actually probably my favorite out of the final worlds in each arc. I think that a lot of people might be harsh on it, especially given the fact that it kind of came out at a time where Wizard101 was kind of starting its slump, so people might not look back on it with as much favor as some other worlds. Next up, and finally, we have the world I've been walking around this whole time, and that is Caramel. Now, I will say, this is on my personal list of underrated worlds. I would say that Caramel is by far one of the most underrated worlds in Wizard101, because a lot of people actually really don't like the world. It always surprises me when I see a lot of people hating on Caramel, because I think Caramel is one of KingsIsle's best worlds ever created. The story is very engaging, it has very fun characters, and every time I play it, I find myself actually enjoying the dialogue and the story compared to a lot of other worlds where I don't get that as much. And then my favorite part of the world, and this was a lot of people's least favorite at the time, I think the aesthetic of it is really, really cool. There's something very, very intriguing and always very interesting in a video game with a world or area that is over the top, innocent, and cartoonish that actually hides kind of a dark and really horrid kind of interior underneath it, right? Because Caramel's whole idea is it's this over the top like yippee, and then it turns out that capitalism is destroying everything because they're making the people work in factories, and Nana is like corporate overload, like printing out copies of herself. It's a lot. If you haven't paid attention to the story of Caramel, go through it again and pay attention to it because it is quite fun. I'm not going to lie. Let's move on to my list of my underrated worlds. I will say, because I'm not going to talk about it a second time, obviously, Caramel would definitely be on my like top 5 most underrated worlds list. I would even put it right at the top. I would say that this world is one of my favorites, if not my favorite in Wizard101, and a lot of people criminally underrate it as a world. So let's move on. I'm going to do them in world order of what I think is most underrated. So first up, we have Celestia, and I will say this is one of the only worlds that appeared in both the underrated and overrated categories when people responded to my questions. I would personally say Celestia is underrated because not a lot of people like Celestia. Now, I'll admit something. Personally, I was a Celestia hater back in the day. For the longest time, and a lot of my world ranking videos, if you go back and watch them, Celestia is near the bottom. And I will say, Celestia has its fair share of problems, and I don't think it's one of the best worlds in Wizard101. But calling it one of the worst, I think, is really underrating the world in general. I think that Celestia has a lot going for it. First off, obviously it has amazing music. The story is pretty good as well. I'd say the main complaint I would have with Celestia is it doesn't really tie in with Arc 2 very well because Morganth doesn't really appear in it until the very end. Realistically, what Celestia is supposed to do for Arc 2 is it's supposed to set up that Morganth is the big bad because it's kind of showing the after effects that Morganth has on the world. And my favorite part of Celestia, and what I would like to comment on here, is Celestia, I think, is very, very well balanced as a world, because when you show up in Celestia, if you do no other side quests, you will be level 43 or 44. And if you enter Celestia at that level, it is actually quite a difficult challenge, especially with the introduction of critical and different astral magics. It's very interesting to suddenly go from Dragonspire, which is very simple mechanics, to Celestia. On top of that, Celestia has the fun little side aspect of it is if you do Wintertusk first, you enter Celestia at a way higher level, like level 50 to 56, somewhere in that range. And Celestia becomes a lot easier as a result if you do it that way. And I think it's very interesting to have that option, to either breeze through Celestia or actually have a semi-difficult challenge with it. I would say the one thing, and I think a lot of people will agree with this, the one thing that stops Celestia from really being a very decent world is honestly Crustacean Empire, because Crustacean Empire, one street, takes about an hour to do, and it's mainly because the teleporters absolutely suck, and you have to walk back and forth like through the longest street in the game so many times. And I will say, I think it makes Celestia as a whole much less impactful and much less fun because of it. Like literally that one street really has that much impact on this world. So that's my opinion. You may have a different opinion than me, but I do think Celestia is underrated. I think it might not be one of the best worlds in the game, but it's certainly not one of the worst like a lot of people claim that it is. Okay, now I know what you're thinking. You're like, Noah, you just jump cut to Khrysalis in an underrated worlds video? That's crazy. And yes it is, because Khrysalis is not a fun world to go through. And in fact, I would say it's one of the worst worlds in Wizard101. But I feel like not a lot of people factor in the fact that Khrysalis was released in 2 parts. When Khrysalis came out, the first half of it from levels 90 to 95 was released separately from 95 to 100, and when they did this, it kind of split the world into two separate parts, which is the reason why when you do it all the way through now, it feels so long, because it's actually almost 2 worlds of content technically. And I will say, I think Khrysalis Part 2, realistically, if it was separate from Khrysalis Part 1, I would rank it way higher than Khrysalis Part 1 every single time. So this section, I would like to just say, Khrysalis Part 2, very underrated. I think Khrysalis as a whole is kind of a C tier world, but Khrysalis Part 1 is like an F tier and Khrysalis Part 2 is like an A tier, which really makes it hard to rank this world fairly, in my opinion. I think a lot of people look at it as this very, very long slog of a world, because it is a very long slog of a world, but not a lot of people take into account the fact that Khrysalis Part 2 on its own, first off, is a little bit shorter than Khrysalis Part 1, and second off, it's really interesting and almost fun to do at times. Like, I would say the streets in Khrysalis Part 2 are much more fun than Khrysalis Part 1. So whether or not the world deserves to be called underrated as a whole, I'll leave that up to you guys. I personally think Khrysalis Part 2 is underrated. Part 1's probably rated exactly as you'd expect. Okay, next up, we have one of my favorite worlds in Wizard101, and I think the prime example of an underrated world, and that is Mirage. I think Mirage is just simply one of the best worlds in Wizard101, from the actual quests themselves, to the music, to the setting, to the characters especially. I think the characters in Mirage are the best characters in Wizard101, and I think a lot of people kind of are distracted by Ishtar, which makes sense. Ishtar is there a lot and she is kind of annoying, but it also has characters such as Ozymandias, who I think is one of the best in Wizard101. It has the Sultana, which is the Sultana, let's be real, and there are quite a few other minor characters that I think are very interesting in this world. I mean, Mr. Clean shows up. That's pretty sick, I'm not gonna lie. A lot of people, from what I've seen, put this world kind of as like a mid-tier world, but I think that's criminally underrating Mirage. I think Mirage is one of the best worlds in Wizard101, and it has one of the most climactic finales in a Wizard101 world. I mean, you fight Grandfather Spider and like 3 shadow versions of past enemies, like the Shadow Walkie, which is the Shadow Jabberwock, Shadow Bort Malletmane, which, let's be real, that one was kind of shoehorned in there for some reason. And there's another shadow one, but I forget who it is. But it just makes the world feel very climactic as a whole. And I think this world is very fun and I want to do it again. Like right now, just walking around talking about it, I want to play this world again. I don't have any wizards near Mirage, which is unfortunate, but I'll find a way to play it again soon. Now, obviously, I would say, personally, I've already talked about 2 that I would also consider underrated earlier in the community section, like Imperia and Caramel. So that would probably go here in this section if I was just making the video my personal opinion, but instead we'll talk about Novus real quick and wrap this up. Now, I won't say Novus is super underrated. I don't really know people's opinions on it. I think a lot of people kind of thought it was which, to be fair, I do think that this world isn't really an S tier world. I don't even think it's an A tier world, but I do think in terms of Arc 4, there's a strong case to be made that Novus is up there, like right behind Caramel, as being one of the better Arc 4 worlds. Beyond the fact that the world is just really kind of wacky and fun, there's also the cool fact that it's kind of like a collage of past worlds, which it's kind of like detracting a little bit from Lemuria, because Lemuria had the same kind of shtick to it, but I think that Novus does it really well, and it's kind of interesting to have to deal with all these different groups of people. I think the quest line itself is very fun, and like Novus, in terms of quest line, is probably the strongest of Arc 4. I think that it beats out Caramel a little bit in terms of quest. Caramel, though, is probably better in other ways. I remember that when Novus came out, I actually very much enjoyed doing it, and I don't think I've done it many times since then. I think I've only done it once or twice since it came out, but I think that this world isn't really like a banger. I don't think it's bad, and I think that it should probably be in more people's not necessarily underrated worlds, but more people should be talking about it than do. I feel like I haven't heard anything about Novus since it came out, which I think is a shame because Novus is actually pretty decent. I would put it like a B or even a low A tier world. So I think that's it for today. I just kind of wanted to get a more positive video out there and more a discussion video like I used to. I think next one will be more overrated worlds, so we're back to negative, but it's not negative about King's Isle, it's negative about worlds, which is a bit different. So let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. I would love to hear them. Discussion is always very fun on these types of videos, discussing with other people or discussing with me. Either way, I think it's very fun. But that's it for today. Make sure to drop a like, hit the sub button, and even hit the join button if you want to. If not, that's fine as well. And I will see you guys in the next video. Have a good one.